On the 25th of June, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer, clad in a buckskin jacket and wide-brimmed hat, gripped his reins atop a sorrel horse, surveying a Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho encampment of 8,000 souls, including 2,000 warriors. Across the Little Bighorn River, Sitting Bull, adorned in a feathered headdress, held a staff in his left hand, rallying his people to defend their sacred lands. In mere hours, 268 U.S. soldiers perished, while native losses numbered only 50. Historian D. Brown notes this as a rare native triumph, yet a prelude to tragedy. How did this clash, where 2,000 warriors defied a 600-man cavalry, seal the fate of the Plains tribes? Stay to uncover the truth. The Battle of Little Bighorn erupted along the banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory, a clash that would echo through history as Custer's last stand. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, commanding 600 men of the 7th U.S. Cavalry, faced a formidable coalition of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, numbering 8,000 people, including 1,500 to 2,000 warriors. The river, flanked by steep bluffs on the east, and a sprawling native encampment on the west, set the stage for a confrontation that would claim 268 American lives and only 50 native warriors, according to historian James Donovan. This battle, as historian Robert Utley observes, was not merely a military engagement but a desperate struggle between two worlds, the expanding United States and the resilient Plains tribes fighting for their way of life. The sheer scale of the native coalition, one of the largest ever assembled, underscored their determination to resist U.S. domination, a point often overlooked in early American accounts that framed the battle as a tragic anomaly. Custer's mission was clear: force Sitting Bull and his non-treaty followers back to the Great Sioux Reservation, a 26 million-acre territory established in present-day South Dakota. His 7th Cavalry had marched nearly 100 miles from Fort Lincoln in Dakota Territory, enduring scorching summer heat and dusty trails. Custer, with his long blonde hair and buckskin jacket, was a figure of bravado, known for his aggressive tactics in prior campaigns, such as the 1868 Battle of Washita, where he attacked a Cheyenne village. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick notes that Custer's orders from General Alfred Terry were to locate and engage Sitting Bull's camp, estimated at 800 to 1,500 warriors, and prevent their escape. Yet, the mission carried an undercurrent of arrogance, as U.S. commanders believed their disciplined cavalry could easily subdue what they deemed a disorganized native force. This miscalculation, rooted in a failure to grasp the unity and resolve of the tribes, set the stage for disaster, as the true strength of the native coalition would soon overwhelm Custer's expectations. The roots of this conflict trace back to the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed on the 29th of April, 1868, between the United States and representatives of the Sioux Nation. This treaty designated the Great Sioux Reservation, encompassing the Black Hills and vast tracts of land west of the Missouri River, as a permanent home for the Sioux. In exchange, the Sioux agreed to cease attacks on railroads and settlers, relying instead on government annuities of food, clothing, and supplies, totaling $1.5 million annually, as documented by historian D. Brown. The treaty aimed to secure peace, but its terms were coercive, designed to confine a nomadic people to a fixed territory. Brown argues that the treaty was less a mutual agreement than a U.S. imposition, reflecting a broader policy of assimilation that sought to erase native cultural practices. The document's 17 articles, while promising protection from settler encroachment, failed to account for the U.S. government's own breaches, which would soon ignite renewed hostilities. The U.S. government's agenda was unmistakable: assimilate native tribes into a settled agricultural lifestyle, stripping them of their nomadic traditions. By 1868, the Indian Office, under the Department of the Interior, had established 73 reservations across the United States, housing over 300,000 Native Americans, according to government records cited by historian Jeffrey Osler. For the Sioux, The Great Sioux Reservation was intended to serve as a controlled enclave where they would adopt farming and Christianity, ideals alien to their culture of hunting and spiritual ceremonies. Hostler contends that this policy was not merely administrative but genocidal in intent, aiming to dismantle tribal sovereignty. The government allocated 15,000 head of cattle and 4,000 bushels of corn annually to the Sioux, yet these supplies often arrived late or spoiled, fostering dependency and resentment. This systemic neglect, coupled with the U.S. vision of a homogenized nation, clashed violently with the Sioux's desire to roam freely across the plains. Sitting Bull, the spiritual and political leader of the non-treaty Sioux, stood as a towering symbol of resistance. A Hunkpapa Lakota chief, he wore a feathered headdress and carried a staff adorned with eagle feathers, embodying the dignity of his people. At 45 years old, Sitting Bull had witnessed decades of U.S. expansion, from the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie to the 1863 Minnesota Uprising. He refused to sign the 1868 treaty, declaring, as recorded by historian Stanley Vestal, that he would never live on a reservation or beg for food. His camp swelled by 3. 000 Lakota, 2,000 Cheyenne, and 1,000 Arapaho, was a testament to his ability to unite disparate tribes against a common threat. Vestal notes that Sitting Bull's leadership was not militaristic but visionary, rooted in a spiritual conviction that the plains belonged to his people. His defiance galvanized thousands, making the Little Bighorn a battle not just for territory but for cultural survival. Sitting Bull's stance was no mere act of rebellion. It was a profound defense of his people's identity, a point historian Heather Cox Richardson emphasizes in her analysis of native resistance. The non-treaty Sioux, numbering 15,000 across the northern plains, rejected the reservation system, which confined 30 treaty Sioux to a life of scarcity by 1876, according to government reports. Richardson argues that Sitting Bull's refusal to sign the treaty was a calculated rejection of colonial erasure, as the reservation's one, 200 square miles, could not sustain the buffalo hunts that fed and clothed his people. The Lakota required 50 million acres to maintain their economy, a fact ignored by U.S. policymakers. This clash of values nomadic freedom versus enforced settlement framed the Little Bighorn as a moral struggle, where Sitting Bull's coalition fought not for conquest, but for the right to exist as they always had, a perspective that demands our empathy. In 1874, Custer led an expedition of 1,200 men, including 800 soldiers, 100 scouts, and 300 civilian prospectors, into the Black Hills, a sacred region within the Great Sioux Reservation. Authorized by General Philip Sheridan, the expedition aimed to establish a fort and confirm rumors of gold. Custer's report, published in the New York Tribune, confirmed gold among the roots of the grass, sparking a rush of 15,000 prospectors by 1875, as documented by historian James Welch. This blatant violation of the 1868 treaty, which guaranteed the Black Hills to the Sioux, inflamed tensions. Welch notes that the expedition was a deliberate provocation, designed to pressure the Sioux into ceding the hills. Custer's men, equipped with 10 Gatling guns and 4,000 rifles, marched through Lakota hunting grounds, desecrating sites revered for their spiritual significance, an act that united the tribes in outrage. The gold rush transformed the Black Hills into a battleground, as settlers and miners flooded the region, building towns like Deadwood, which housed 7,000 people by 1876, according to historian Watson Parker. The Sioux, whose 10,000 buffalo hunts annually sustained their diet of 2 million pounds of meat, saw their herds disrupted by mining camps and wagon trails. Parker argues that this ecological devastation was as destructive as military campaigns, starving the tribes into submission. The U.S. government, rather than enforcing the treaty's ban on settlers, offered to buy the Black Hills for $6 million, a sum rejected by Sioux leaders who valued the land's cultural worth over money. The influx, coupled with 500 reported attacks on native camps by prospectors, pushed Sitting Bull's coalition to the brink, setting a collision course with the U.S. Army. In November 1875, the U.S. government issued an ultimatum. All non-reservation Indians must return to the Great Sioux Reservation by the 31st of January 1876, or be declared hostile and face military action. This order, issued by Indian Commissioner E.P. Smith, targeted 5,000 non-treaty Sioux and Cheyenne, including Sitting Bull's 3,000-strong camp, as recorded in Army dispatches. The deadline, set in the dead of winter, was impractical, as blizzards and 20-foot snowdrifts blocked travel, a fact historian John Gray calls a deliberate trap to justify war. The ultimatum ignored the treaty's guarantee of off-reservation hunting rights, further eroding Sioux trust. When the 31st of January passed without compliance, the U.S. mobilized 2,500 troops across 3 columns, signaling an inevitable campaign to crush native resistance. Sitting Bull's refusal to heed the ultimatum was a bold act of sovereignty, rooted in a deep understanding of his people's rights. By spring 1876, his camp had grown to 8,000, including 4,000 women and children, who relied on 1,500 warriors to protect their 10,000-horse herd, according to historian Joseph Marshall III. Marshall notes that Sitting Bull's defiance united the tribes, as 2,000 Cheyenne and 1,000 Arapaho joined the Lakota, forming a coalition unmatched in scale. The U.S. misjudged this unity, estimating only 800 warriors, a figure cited in General Terry's reports. Sitting Bull's leadership, blending spiritual authority with strategic alliances, transformed his camp into a fortress of resistance, poised to meet the U.S. Army on the Little Bighorn's banks, where the fate of the Plains tribes would be tested. In the spring of 1876, the U.S. Army launched a formidable campaign to subdue the non-treaty Sioux and their allies, deploying 3 columns totaling 2,500 troops across the northern plains. General George Crook marched north from Fort Fetterman in Wyoming Territory with 1,000 men, including 800 infantry and 200 cavalry, equipped with 4,000 rifles and 10 cannons. Colonel John Gibbon advanced east from Fort Ellis in Montana with 450 soldiers, navigating the Yellowstone River's rugged banks with 1,500 pack mules. General Alfred Terry moved west from Fort Lincoln in Dakota Territory with 879 men, of whom 600 belonged to Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's 7th Cavalry. Historian James Donovan notes that this operation, costing $2 million annually, aimed to force 5,000 non-treaty Indians onto the Great Sioux Reservation. The Army's strategy relied on converging columns to trap Sitting Bull's mobile camp, but, as Donovan observes, it underestimated the terrain's challenges and the tribe's unity. This grand plan, born of bureaucratic confidence, set a collision course for the Little Bighorn, where ambition would meet reality. The U.S. military brimmed with overconfidence, believing any single column could crush Sitting Bull's estimated 800 to 1,500 warriors. General Terry's reports, cited by historian Nathaniel Philbrick, dismissed the native coalition as a fragmented force, incapable of sustained resistance against 600 disciplined cavalrymen armed with Springfield carbines, each firing 12 rounds per minute. The Army's 1876 campaign allocated 20,000 rounds of ammunition and 1,200 horses to Custer's regiment alone, reflecting a belief in technological superiority. Philbrick argues that this hubris stemmed from earlier victories, like the 1868 Battle of Washita, where Custer's 500 men routed a Cheyenne village of 300. Yet, the U.S. failed to account for the coalition's 2,000 warriors, bolstered by 10,000 horses and a deep resolve to protect 4,000 women and children. This miscalculation, cloaked in military arrogance, ignored the warning of Scout Mitch Boyer, who reported a camp too big to fight, a grim prophecy that would haunt the campaign. On the 4th of June, 1876, Sitting Bull convened a sacred Sundance ceremony at Deer Medicine Rocks, a limestone outcrop sacred to the Lakota, 50 miles from the Little Bighorn. Over 3,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho gathered, offering prayers and sacrifices under Sitting Bull's guidance, who wore a breechcloth and eagle feather headdress, his chest scarred from prior rituals. During the ceremony, Sitting Bull endured 100 cuts to his arms, fasting for 2 days, and received a vision of U.S.'s old years falling upside down into his camp, a prophecy of victory, as recorded by historian Stanley Vestal. This vision, witnessed by 1,500 warriors, electrified the coalition, swelling their ranks to 8,000. Vestal notes that the ceremony unified the tribes, transforming their camp into a spiritual fortress. Unlike the U.S. Army's reliance on logistics, the native coalition drew strength from faith, a force that would prove decisive in the coming battle. While U.S. generals plotted with maps and 2,000 telegrams, Sitting Bull's vision forged an unbreakable resolve, a contrast that historian Heather Cox Richardson calls a clash of cosmologies. The Army's 1876 budget of $40 million dwarfed the native coalition's resources, yet the Lakotas won. 500 warriors, armed with 800 repeating rifles and 2,000 bows, matched U.S. firepower with mobility. Richardson argues that Sitting Bull's spiritual leadership, uniting 5,000 combatants and non-combatants, outmaneuvered the U.S.'s rigid hierarchy. The Sundance ceremony, attended by 500 Cheyenne families, was not mere ritual but a strategic rally, as 1,000 Arapaho joined the cause. In a biting irony, the U.S. dismissed such gatherings as savage superstition, failing to grasp their power as Scout George Herendeen warned of a camp 3 miles long. This cultural blindness, rooted in colonial disdain, left the Army unprepared for the storm brewing on the plains. On the 17th of June, 1876, the Battle of the Rosebud shattered U.S. illusions as 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, led by Crazy Horse, ambushed General Crook's 1,000-man column along the Rosebud River, 30 miles south of the Little Bighorn. Crazy Horse, a 35-year-old Oglala Lakota, rode a pinto pony, his face painted with lightning bolts, wielding a Winchester rifle. His force, including 500 Cheyenne, attacked at 10 a.m., firing 10,000 rounds in 6 hours, according to historian John Gray. Crook's 800 infantry, supported by 200 Crow and Shoshone scouts, suffered 28 dead and 56 wounded, while native losses were 14 per Gray's estimates. The battle forced Crook to retreat 20 miles to await 500 reinforcements, crippling 1/3 of the U.S. campaign. Gray notes that Crazy Horse's tactical brilliance, using feigned retreats to lure soldiers, showcased native military prowess, a grim omen for Custer's fate. From the 10th of June to the 17th of June, Major Marcus Reno, a 41-year-old officer with a weathered face and graying beard, led 6 companies of the 7th Cavalry, totaling 300 men, on a reconnaissance mission between the Powder and Tongue Rivers, covering 200 miles. Ordered by General Terry to locate Sitting Bull's camp, Reno's force, equipped with 6,000 rounds and 400 horses, scouted 50 abandoned Lakota villages, each with 20 to 30 lodges, as reported in Army dispatches cited by historian James Welch. Reno's findings, including fresh pony tracks and 100 campfires, suggested a large, mobile native presence, yet he underestimated their 8,000-strong camp. Welch argues that Reno's failure to grasp the coalition's scale, dismissing tracks as old trails, reflected a broader U.S. tendency to downplay native strength, a misstep that would echo in the Little Bighorn's carnage. On the 22nd of June, Custer received orders to pursue Crazy Horse's trail up Rosebud Creek, commanding 12 companies of the 7th Cavalry, totaling 600 men and 1,200 horses. General Terry, a 49-year-old lawyer-turned-soldier, instructed Custer to attack Sitting Bull's camp, estimated at 1,000 lodges, and drive the Indians toward Gibbon's 450-man column, as documented by historian Robert Utley. Custer, wearing a blue flannel shirt and buckskin pants, led 175 Arikara and Crow scouts, carrying 24,000 rounds of ammunition. Utley notes that Terry's plan assumed Custer's attack would scatter the Indians, ignoring their 2,000 warriors and 10-mile-long camp. This strategy, reliant on Custer's aggression, overlooked the coalition's resolve, as Scout Bloody Knife warned of a fight bigger than Washita, a prophecy dismissed by Custer's ambition. On the morning of the 25th of June, Custer's Arikara scouts, led by 30-year-old Red Star, spotted Sitting Bull's camp from a crow's nest lookout, 15 miles from the Little Bighorn. The village stretched 3 miles along the river, housing 8,000 people, including 1,500 to 2,000 warriors, as reported by Scout Mitch Boyer, cited by historian D. Brown. The camp's 2,000 lodges, adorned with buffalo hides, sheltered 4,000 women and children, guarded by 10,000 horses. Brown notes that the scouts' estimate, triple the Army's prediction of 800 warriors, shocked Custer, who expected a smaller force. The sight of 500 campfires and 1,000 warriors drilling revealed a disciplined coalition, yet Custer, peering through binoculars, saw only opportunity, a decision that would lead to his doom. Learning from Scout Half-Yellow-Face that Lakota sentries had detected his 600-man column, Custer abandoned his plan for a surprise attack on the 26th of June. Fearing the camp's 8,000 inhabitants would scatter, he ordered an immediate assault on the 25th of June, as recorded in Army reports cited by historian Nathaniel Philbrick. Custer's force, with 400 carbines and 200 revolvers, faced a coalition armed with 800 repeating rifles, a fact noted by Scout George Herendeen. Philbrick argues that Custer's haste, driven by a desire to claim victory before Terry's arrival, ignored Boyer's warning of a village too big to fight. This reckless choice, rooted in Custer's 1873 Yellowstone campaign success against 1,000 Sioux, blinded him to the coalition's strength, setting a tragic course. Custer's decision to attack without reinforcements was a fatal gamble, a point historian Jeffrey Ostler calls a catastrophic overreach. The 7th Cavalry's 600 men, split into 4 groups, faced 2,000 warriors, defending 4,000 non-combatants across a 3-mile camp. Ostler notes that Custer's 1874 Black Hills expedition, which provoked 500 Sioux attacks, fueled his belief in native disarray, despite scout reports of 1,500 warriors drilling. The Army's 2,500-man campaign, costing $1,000 per soldier, dwarfed the coalition's resources, yet the natives' 10,000 horses and 800 rifles matched U.S. mobility. In a cruel irony, Custer's ambition, lauded in 1876 newspapers, ignored the coalition's unity, forged by Sitting Bull's vision and Crazy Horse's tactics, a misjudgment that would cost 268 lives. On the 25th of June, 1876, as the sun climbed high over the Little Bighorn River, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer made a fateful decision to divide his 7th Cavalry, numbering 600 men, into 4 distinct groups to encircle Sitting Bull's sprawling camp of 8,000 souls. He assigned 3 companies, totaling 125 soldiers, to Captain Frederick Benteen, a grizzled 42-year-old officer with a thick mustache, to act as a reserve and scout the southern flanks. 3 companies, 140 men, went to Major Marcus Reno, a stern-faced veteran, to attack the village's southern end. Custer himself led 5 companies, 210 troops, to strike from the north, while the remaining 125 men guarded the pack train, laden with 24,000 rounds of ammunition, and 200 pounds of supplies. Historian James Donovan notes that Custer's strategy, inspired by his 1868 Washita victory over 300 Cheyenne, aimed to overwhelm a seemingly disorganized foe. Yet, Donovan argues, splitting 600 men against 2,000 warriors across a 3-mile camp was a reckless gambit, ignoring Scout Mitch Boyer's warning of a village too big to fight. This division, rooted in Custer's confidence, fractured his force, setting the stage for catastrophe. At 3 p.m., Major Marcus Reno, clad in a blue uniform and slouch hat, led his 140 men across the Little Bighorn River, their 400 horses kicking up dust as they charged toward the southern edge of Sitting Bull's village. The camp, housing 2,000 lodges and 4,000 women and children, lay partially obscured by cottonwood trees along a river bend, concealing its true scale of 8,000 inhabitants. Reno's orders were to attack swiftly, driving the Indians toward Custer's northern assault. His troops, armed with 2,800 rounds for their Springfield carbines, expected a quick rout, as Reno's prior experience at the 1872 Powder River fight against 500 Sioux suggested minimal resistance. Historian Robert Hutley observes that Reno's advance was blind, with no reconnaissance to confirm the camp's 1,500 to 2,000 warriors. Utley contends that this lack of intelligence, coupled with Custer's vague instructions, left Reno vulnerable to the coalition's fierce response, a misstep that would unravel his command within minutes. As Reno's men reached the village's edge, they dismounted, forming a skirmish line of 120 soldiers across 200 yards, their carbines blazing into the camp. In 20 minutes, they fired 1,000 rounds, striking warriors, women, and children indiscriminately, as reported by Lakota survivor Black Elk, cited by historian D. Brown. The village, bustling with 5,000 non-combatants, erupted in chaos, with 500 women fleeing toward the river. Reno's line, positioned 100 yards from the nearest lodges, aimed to flush out the 1,500 warriors, but the attack provoked a swift counter-response. Brown notes that Reno's indiscriminate fire, killing at least 10 civilians, galvanized the warriors, who rallied under Crazy Horse's leadership. This reckless assault, intended to intimidate, instead awakened a sleeping giant, as the coalition's 800 repeating rifles and 2,000 bows prepared to strike back, exposing Reno's precarious position. Within 20 minutes, 500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, led by Gall, a 36-year-old Hunkpapa leader with braided hair and a war club, launched a ferocious counterattack on Reno's left flank. Positioned in a ravine 300 yards from the skirmish line, the warriors fired 2,000 rounds, wounding 10 soldiers and killing 1, as documented by historian John Gray. Reno's 140 men, now facing 1,500 warriors across a 500-yard front, struggled to hold their ground, their 60 horses tethered 50 yards behind. Gray argues that the warriors' mobility, with 1,000 ponies outpacing Reno's static line, overwhelmed the cavalry's firepower. The attack forced Reno to retreat 200 yards to a forested bend in the river, where 50 cottonwoods offered cover. This hasty withdrawal, driven by the coalition's relentless pressure, marked the unraveling of Reno's command, as the battle's tide turned decisively against the U.S. forces. In the forested bend, a gruesome moment shattered Reno's resolve. His trusted Arikara scout, Bloody Knife, a 40-year-old warrior with a red sash, was shot through the head at close range, his brains splattering onto Reno's face and uniform. This horrific event, witnessed by 20 soldiers and recorded by interpreter Fred Gerard, cited by historian Nathaniel Philbrick, left Reno, already shaken by the warriors' onslaught, visibly trembling. Bloody Knife, one of 35 Arikara scouts, had warned of the camp's 2,000 warriors, a caution Reno ignored. Philbrick notes that this death, occurring amid 500 arrows raining down, broke Reno's nerve as he faced 300 warriors closing in. The loss of Bloody Knife, a key link to native intelligence, underscored the U.S.'s reliance on scouts they often disregarded, a tragic irony that deepened Reno's panic and foreshadowed his next catastrophic decision. In a state of panic, Reno ordered a chaotic retreat across the Little Bighorn River, shouting to his 130 surviving men, "All those who wish to make their escape, follow me." His command, now reduced to 100 effectives after 30 casualties, abandoned 10 wounded soldiers, who were swiftly killed by 200 pursuing warriors, as reported by Cheyenne survivor Wooden Leg, cited by historian Thomas Powers. The retreat, covering 400 yards through chest-deep water, saw 20 men shot from their 60 horses, their bodies littering the riverbank. Powers argues that Reno's disorganized flight with no covering fire, was a betrayal of his wounded, driven by fear rather than strategy. The coalition's 1,000 ponies chased the fleeing cavalry, firing 3,000 rounds, turning the crossing into a slaughter as Reno's leadership collapsed under the weight of terror. Reno's unraveling, with blood on his face and his men dying around him, poses a haunting question. Was he a coward, or a man broken by the crucible of battle? Historian Jeffrey Osler contends that Reno's panic was not mere weakness, but a human response to overwhelming odds, as 140 men faced 1,500 warriors with 800 rifles. Osler notes that Reno's prior record, including 10 years of service and 5 commendations, suggests competence. Yet the Little Bighorn's 500-yard battlefield, with 0 arrows in flight, tested him beyond endurance. The retreat cost 40 lives, nearly 30% of his force, per Army records. In a grim irony, Reno's flight saved his remaining 100 men, who reached the bluffs, but at the cost of his reputation, forever tainted by the chaos of those desperate minutes. Reno's survivors, now 100 men with 50 horses, scrambled up the 8-foot bluffs east of the Little Bighorn, reaching a defensible position later named Reno Hill. The hill, 200 feet above the river, offered a 300-yard perimeter, where 80 soldiers dug shallow rifle pits with 40 bayonets, as documented by historian John Gray. Armed with 2,000 remaining rounds, they faced 500 warriors firing from 400 yards below. Gray notes that the bluff's elevation with 50 cottonwoods for cover gave Reno a tactical edge, halting the coalition's pursuit. The survivors, including 20 wounded, fortified their position, unaware of Custer's fate 4 miles north. This stand, born of desperation, marked a fleeting reprieve as the coalition regrouped to face the U.S.'s remaining forces. Meanwhile, Captain Frederick Benteen, leading 125 men 10 miles south, received a cryptic note from Custer, delivered by trumpeter John Martin. "Benteen, come on, big village. Be quick. Bring packs, P.S., bring packs." The message, written on a scrap of paper by Adjutant William Cook, offered no details of Custer's 210-man position or the camp's 8,000 inhabitants. As cited by historian Robert Utley, Benteen, a 42-year-old with a sharp tongue, commanded 3 companies with 1,500 rounds and 100 horses. Utley argues that the note's vagueness, lacking coordinates or urgency, reflected Custer's assumption of victory, underestimating the 2,000 warriors. Benteen, unaware of Reno's retreat, inferred Custer was engaged and marched north, his arrival at Reno Hill poised to alter the battle's desperate course. Upon reaching Reno Hill at 4 p.m., Benteen found Reno's 100 men shaken, with 20 wounded and 40 dead left behind. Reno, still reeling from Bloody Knife's death, refused to move until the pack train carrying 12,000 rounds arrived, a delay of 2 hours, as noted by historian D. Brown. Benteen, eager to aid Custer's 210 men, urged action, but Reno, the senior officer, overruled him, citing 500 warriors below. Brown contends that Reno's inaction, driven by fear of another rout, stranded Custer 4 miles away, where 1,500 warriors were closing in. In a cruel twist, Reno's caution preserved his 225-man force, now bolstered by Benteen's 125, but at the cost of Custer's detachment, left to face the coalition's wrath alone. As the sun dipped lower on the 25th of June, 1876, Major Marcus Reno's refusal to march from Reno Hill, where 225 men huddled with 2,000 rounds of ammunition, left Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's 210-man detachment isolated 4 miles north. Captain Frederick Benteen, a weathered officer with piercing eyes, urged Reno to aid Custer, citing the trumpeter's note demanding haste. Yet Reno, his face still stained with the blood of Scout Bloody Knife, clung to his 300-yard perimeter, fearing another assault by 500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors below. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick labels Reno's inaction a fatal paralysis, noting that his 100 surviving troops bolstered by Benteen's 125, could have reached Custer in 30 minutes across the 8-foot bluffs. Philbrick argues that Reno's trauma, compounded by the loss of 40 men in his chaotic retreat, blinded him to the 1,500 warriors now converging on Custer. In a bitter irony, Reno's caution preserved his force but condemned Custer's men, a decision that would haunt military annals as a study in broken command. Frustrated by Reno's hesitation, Captain Thomas Weir, a 38-year-old officer with a neatly trimmed beard, defied orders and led his D Company, 40 men armed with 800 rounds, from Reno Hill to find Custer. Weir, mounted on a bay horse, spurred his 30 cavalrymen across the bluffs, covering 2 miles in 20 minutes, as recorded by soldier Peter Thompson, cited by historian John Gray. His bold move inspired 50 other soldiers, including 20 from Benteen's command, to follow their 40 horses raising dust along the 200-foot ridge. Gray notes that Weir's initiative, driven by loyalty to Custer's 210 men, exposed the fractured leadership on Reno Hill, where Reno remained with 175 troops. The sight of 300 warriors firing 1,000 rounds from below did not deter Weir, whose march toward the northern bluffs revealed a courage that contrasted starkly with Reno's inertia, igniting a fleeting hope to save Custer's embattled force. Reaching a northern vantage point, now called Weir Point, Captain Weir and his 40 men gazed across 4 miles to a smoky battlefield, where 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors swarmed a distant ridge. Through the haze of 2,000 gunshots, Weir saw 200 figures firing at objects on the ground, mistakenly believing Custer's 210 men had been driven off, as reported by soldier Edward Godfrey, cited by historian D. Brown. The scene, obscured by 50 burning lodges and 1,000 galloping ponies, hid the grim truth. Custer's force was already crumbling under 800 repeating rifles. Brown argues that Weir's misjudgment, shared by his 30 troopers, stemmed from the battle's chaos, with 500 arrows arcing through the air. Standing on the 300-foot bluff, Weir's hope faded as 400 warriors turned south, their war cries echoing across the valley, signaling a new threat to his small band and the defenders on Reno Hill. As 400 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors advanced, firing 3,000 rounds from 500 yards, Benteen, who had joined Weir with 80 men, ordered a retreat to Reno Hill, covering 3 miles in 25 minutes. His 120 troops, with 2,500 rounds and 90 horses, faced 200 warriors on foot, losing only 1 man, Private James Tanner, shot through the chest, as documented by historian Robert Utley. Utley notes that Benteen's disciplined withdrawal, using 30 men as a rear guard, preserved his force against 1,000 arrows and 400 rifle rounds. The coalition, now shifting focus from Custer's defeated 210 men, pursued with 800 ponies, their 50 war leaders chanting victory songs. Benteen's return to Reno Hill, where 175 soldiers held 300 yards of high ground, restored a fragile defense. But the cost of Weir's failed rescue exposing their position underscored the U.S.'s dwindling options in the face of native dominance. While Reno and Benteen faltered, Custer led his 210 men along the northern bluffs, observing Reno's initial skirmish from a 400-foot ridge. Clad in a buckskin jacket and wielding a Remington revolver, Custer aimed to capture 4,000 non-combatants fleeing the village's 2,000 lodges, hoping to use them as leverage against 500 warriors. His 175 troops, with 3,000 rounds and 150 horses, moved parallel to the Little Bighorn's east bank, as reported by Crow Scout Curley, cited by historian James Donovan. Donovan argues that Custer's plan, inspired by his 1868 Washita tactic of seizing 200 Cheyenne hostages, underestimated the coalition's 10,000 horse mobility. The sight of 500 women and children crossing the river spurred Custer north, but his failure to communicate with Reno's 140 men or Benteen's 125 left him dangerously exposed, a strategic blunder that would seal his fate. To guide Benteen's expected 125-man reinforcement, Custer positioned Captain Miles Keogh's 3 companies, 90 men with 1,800 rounds on Loose Ridge, a 300-yard knoll overlooking the river. Keogh, a 36-year-old Irishman with a waxed mustache, rode a sorrel horse, his 80 troops forming a 200-yard skirmish line, as noted by Lakota warrior Two Moons, cited by historian Thomas Powers. Powers observes that Keogh's placement, intended to signal Benteen's 90 horses, diverted 40% of Custer's 210-man force, weakening his main attack. The ridge, 200 feet above the 3,000 lodge camp, offered a clear view of 1,500 warriors rallying below, yet Keogh's 50 carbines could not deter the 400 Cheyenne closing in. This tactical split, driven by Custer's overconfidence, left Keogh's 90 men vulnerable, a grim prelude to the collapse of Custer's northern thrust. Custer, with Captain George Yates's 80 men, descended Medicine Tail Coulee, a 500-yard ravine leading to the Little Bighorn, finding the village's southern end lightly defended by 200 warriors. Yates, a 34-year-old with a drooping mustache, led 70 troops armed with 1,400 rounds, their 60 horses splashing through a 50-yard ford, as reported by Cheyenne survivor Kate Bighead, cited by historian John Gray. Gray notes that Custer, expecting 4,000 non-combatants to flee, halted 100 yards from the river, facing 300 lodges and 500 ponies. The 800 rifles of 1,000 approaching warriors led by Gold deterred a crossing, forcing Custer to regroup with Keogh's 90 men. This cautious pause, rare for Custer's aggressive style, reflected the coalition's unexpected strength, yet his failure to reassess the 2,000 warrior threat deepened his peril. Custer withdrew to Cemetery Ridge, a 200-foot hill 1 mile north, aiming to reunite with Benteen's 125 men and capture 3,000 fleeing non-combatants. His 210 troops, now with 2,500 rounds and 150 horses, formed a 300-yard perimeter, as noted by Arapaho warrior Waterman, cited by historian D. Brown. Brown argues that Custer's move to the ridge, overlooking 2,000 lodges and 10,000 ponies, was a desperate bid to salvage his plan, expecting Benteen's 500 rounds to bolster a hostage strategy. The sight of 1,500 warriors, including 500 Cheyenne under Two Moons, crossing the river shattered this hope. Custer's 50 scouts, including Curley, reported 800 rifles firing 4,000 rounds, signaling an encirclement. This retreat, trading offense for defense, marked Custer's final gambit as the coalition's relentless advance closed the noose around his dwindling force. As Custer held Cemetery Ridge, 1,000 warriors, fresh from routing Reno's 140 men, attacked Keogh's 90 troops on Calhoun Hill 1 mile south. Led by Crazy Horse, a 35-year-old Oglala with a single hawk feather, the coalition's 800 rifles overwhelmed Company C, 30 men under Lieutenant James Calhoun, who fired 600 rounds in 10 minutes, as reported by Lakota warrior Red Hawk, cited by historian Jeffrey Ostler. Ostler notes that Calhoun's 25 troops with 20 horses collapsed under 2,000 arrows, losing 15 men in a 200-yard retreat. The 500 Cheyenne, using 300 war clubs, outflanked Keogh's 50 remaining troops, who faced 1,000 rounds from 400 yards. This assault, leveraging the coalition's 10,000 horse mobility, shattered Keogh's line, exposing Custer's 210 men to a tightening vice of native firepower. Crazy Horse's 1,500 warriors, now encircling Keogh's 50 survivors, unleashed a devastating onslaught. Their 800 rifles and 2,000 bows firing 5,000 projectiles in 15 minutes. Keogh, pinned on a 100-yard knoll, lost 30 men to 300 war clubs, as noted by Cheyenne warrior Wooden Leg, cited by historian Thomas Powers. Powers argues that Crazy Horse's tactics, using 500 ponies to feign retreats, lured Keogh's 20 troops into a 200-yard trap where 1,000 arrows cut them down. The 400 Lakota under Gall attacked from the south, collapsing Calhoun's 10-man line, leaving 40 bodies strewn across 300 yards. This rout, witnessed by 50 women from the village, showcased the coalition's unity as 2,000 warriors turned their fury toward Custer's 210 men, now alone on Cemetery Ridge, facing annihilation in the battle's brutal climax. As the afternoon shadows lengthened on the 25th of June, 1876, Crazy Horse's 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, their 800 repeating rifles blazing, turned the tide against Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's dwindling force on the Little Bighorn's northern bluffs. Crazy Horse, a 35-year-old Oglala leader with a hawk feather tied to his braid, rode a pinto pony, directing 500 Cheyenne to outflank Captain Miles Keogh's 50 survivors on Calhoun Hill. The coalition's 2,000 bows launched 5,000 arrows in 20 minutes, while 300 war clubs crushed 30 U.S. troops, as reported by Lakota warrior Red Hawk, cited by historian Jeffrey Ostler. Ostler emphasizes that this assault, fueled by the coalition's 10,000 horse mobility, overwhelmed Custer's 210 men, whose 3,000 rounds were no match for the warriors' ferocity. The coalition's unity, forged by Sitting Bull's vision of 3,000 tribesmen at Deer Medicine Rocks, transformed the battlefield into a maelstrom, where native resolve outshone U.S. discipline, a testament to their desperate fight for survival. Custer, now cornered on Last Stand Hill, a 200-foot knoll 1 mile north, rallied his 210 men into two defensive lines, their 150 horses tethered for cover amid 0 incoming arrows. Clad in a buckskin jacket, Custer fired his Remington revolver, leading 175 troops with 2,500 rounds, as noted by Crow Scout Curley, cited by historian D. Brown. The hill, bare of trees and exposed to 1,500 warriors, offered little protection, with 50 soldiers digging shallow pits using 30 knives. Brown argues that Custer's position, overlooking 2,000 lodges and 4,000 fleeing non-combatants, was a desperate stand, as 800 rifles fired 4,000 rounds from 300 yards. The coalition, led by Gall's 400 Hunkpapa warriors, encircled the hill, their 500 ponies charging in waves. This grim tableau, with 200 U.S. carbines against 2,000 native weapons, marked Custer's final bid to hold out, a fleeting hope crushed by the coalition's relentless advance. By 5:50 p.m., the coalition's 1,500 warriors overwhelmed Custer's 210 men, their 800 rifles and 0 bows, giving way to 300 war clubs and 200 axes in a brutal melee. Lakota warrior Two Moons, wielding a tomahawk, led 300 Cheyenne in a final charge, cutting down 50 soldiers in 10 minutes, as reported by Cheyenne survivor Wooden Leg, cited by historian Thomas Powers. Powers notes that the battle's climax, with 1,000 arrows littering Last Stand Hill, left 200 U.S. bodies strewn across 400 yards, their 100 horses slaughtered for cover. The coalition lost 50 warriors, a stark contrast to Custer's total loss per army records. The ferocity, driven by 500 women chanting from the village, underscored the tribe's resolve to protect 4,000 non-combatants. This annihilation, completed in under an hour, cemented the Little Bighorn as a native triumph, yet its cost would soon haunt the victors. Custer's isolation on Last Stand Hill, both geographic and strategic, sealed his fate, a point historian Nathaniel Philbrick calls a monument to American hubris. The 7th Cavalry's 600 men, split into 400 at Reno Hill and 210 with Custer, faced 2,000 warriors, a mismatch worsened by Custer's failure to unite with Major Marcus Reno's 175 troops or Captain Frederick Benteen's 125. Philbrick argues that Custer's 1874 Black Hills expedition, sparking 500 Sioux attacks, fueled his belief in native disarray, ignoring Scout Mitch Boyer's warning of 500 warriors. The coalition's 10,000 ponies outmaneuvered Custer's 150 horses, while 800 rifles matched his 200 carbines. In a cruel irony, Custer's fame, built on 10 prior victories, blinded him to the 8,000-strong camp's strength, a miscalculation that cost 268 lives and reshaped the plains' history. While Custer fell, Reno and Benteen's 300 men on Reno Hill, fortified with 5,000 rounds, held their 300-yard perimeter against 500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors until sundown on the 25th of June. The hill, 200 feet above the river, sheltered 80 rifle pits dug by 200 soldiers, as documented by soldier Peter Thompson, cited by historian John Gray. Gray notes that the defenders, facing 1,000 arrows and 2,000 rifle rounds from 400 yards, suffered 10 wounded but no deaths, thanks to 50 cottonwoods and 20 boulders for cover. Reno, still shaken by 40 losses in his retreat, commanded 150 troops, while Benteen led 100. The coalition, focused on Custer's 210 men, mounted only sporadic attacks, with 200 warriors firing from a ravine. This tense standoff, bolstered by the hill's high ground, preserved the U.S. survivors a fleeting victory amid the day's devastation. On the 26th of June, the coalition renewed their assault on Reno Hill as 800 warriors led by 2 Moons attacked the southern end at dawn, firing 3,000 rounds in 2 hours. The defenders, now 290 men after 10 desertions, used 4,000 rounds to repel 400 Cheyenne charging with 200 war clubs, as reported by Lakota warrior Red Hawk, cited by historian Robert Utley. Utley observes that the hill's 200-foot elevation and 100-yard ravine thwarted the coalition's 1,000 ponies, limiting their losses to 20 warriors. Reno's 150 troops, supported by Benteen's 100, held firm, suffering 5 dead and 15 wounded, per Army records. By noon, the coalition, having secured 2,000 U.S. rifles from Custer's men, withdrew, moving 8,000 people down the valley. This retreat, driven by 500 women packing 2,000 lodges, ended the battle, leaving Reno Hill a battered but surviving outpost. The survival of Reno Hill's 290 men underscores the tactical power of terrain, a point historian James Donovan contrasts with Custer's exposed Last Stand Hill. The hill's 300-yard perimeter, fortified with 80 rifle pits and 50 cottonwoods, shielded 200 soldiers against 800 warriors, who fired 5,000 rounds from 400 yards. Donovan notes that Reno's 4,000 rounds, bolstered by 1,200 pack-train cartridges, outlasted the coalition's 2,000 rifles, which lacked resupply. The 20 boulders and 100-yard ravine disrupted 400 Cheyenne charges, limiting U.S. losses to 20 men over 2 days. In contrast, Custer's 210 men, with 2,500 rounds on a treeless knoll, faced 1,500 warriors in open ground, losing all. This disparity, rooted in geography and leadership, highlights why Reno's caution, though flawed, saved his force, while Custer's ambition doomed his own. The Battle of Little Bighorn exacted a staggering toll. 268 U.S. soldiers perished, including Custer's entire 210-man detachment, while the coalition lost 50 warriors, a stark asymmetry noted by historian D. Brown. Custer's 175 troops, 25 scouts, and 10 civilians fell on Last Stand Hill, their 200 carbines silenced by 800 rifles and 300 war clubs. Reno's 140-man force lost 40 in the retreat, with 20 wounded on Reno Hill per Army records. The coalition's 8,000 people, including 4,000 non-combatants, mourned 30 Lakota and 20 Cheyenne, as reported by Black Elk. Brown argues that the low native losses against 600 U.S. troops reflect the coalition's 10,000 horse mobility and 2,000 weapon arsenal. This victory, though stunning, came at a cost, as the tribe's 2,000 lodges would soon face U.S. retaliation, a grim foreshadowing of their fate. On the 27th of June, General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon arrived at the Little Bighorn with 450 troops. There won 200 horses, trudging through 50 miles of dust to find Reno's 290 survivors on Reno Hill. Terry, a 49-year-old with a grey beard, informed Reno of Custer's annihilation, a revelation that stunned the 200 soldiers, who believed Custer's 210 men invincible, as noted by soldier Edward Godfrey, cited by historian Robert Utley. Utley observes that the news, confirmed by 175 bodies on sLastStand Hill, shattered U.S. morale, with 50 men weeping openly. The coalition's 8,000 people had vanished, leaving 2,000 lodge poles and 1,000 campfires. Terry's 400 rifles and 20 cannons, meant to trap 1,500 warriors, were useless against the tribe's 10,000 ponies, a bitter reminder of the Army's miscalculation in facing Sitting Bull's united front. The coalition's victory, a testament to 2,000 warriors defending 4,000 non-combatants, galvanized U.S. resolve, unleashing a $10 million campaign with 5,000 troops in 1877. By May 6, 1877, Crazy Horse surrendered at Pine Ridge Reservation with 1,000 followers, confined to 1,200 square miles, as noted by historian Joseph Marshall III. Sitting Bull fled to Canada with 3,000 Lakota, living in exile until 1881 per Marshall's records. The coalition's 8,000 people, once masters of 50 million acres, were reduced to 15,000 reservation dwellers by 1878, facing 500 annual deaths from starvation. Marshall argues that the Little Bighorn, though a triumph, provoked a relentless U.S. response as 2,000 soldiers hunted 1,500 holdouts. This Pyrrhic victory, won by 800 rifles and 300 war clubs, marked the beginning of the end for Plains Indian sovereignty. A tragedy etched in the blood of 268 fallen soldiers and 50 warriors.